I will go ahead and begin questions. I want to get clarifications and talk about the disaster relief fund. The budget originally asked for 19.4 billion, but as I noted in my statement, we recently appropriated 12 billion for this purpose. So I noticed in your statement you mentioned the figure 14.1. Is that an adjustment from what readjusted budget figure from what you saw us appropriate in the 2019?
Yes, ma'am. I think the president's budget was 19.9 billion. I think by the time we had input to it, we adjusted it to 14.1, which is I think 2 billion over. There's some math in there to adjust it, but we think the 14.1 billion gives us enough in the DRF for this year to make sure we can manage all the disasters that we have and any disasters that we believe will come in the next fiscal year. So we believe we have enough.
Okay, what is the current balance in that disaster relief fund?
It's a little over $29 billion right now, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. So that's carried over from
correct.
Past years. So what's your level of confidence that this balance is sufficient to address all of our fiscal year 2019 needs?
I have high level of confidence that it has all the resources in it to deal with the disasters that exist today, mm-hmm. and any disasters that we may face in the near future. I think if we see another 2017-18 disaster season, that will change the dynamics of how much money is in the DRF, mm-hmm. and we'd have to talk about supplemental if we had another 17-18 kind of season. But for right now, there's enough money in the DRF for us to run operations this FY.
Okay, so I just reiterating, just for the record, that 14.1 is your request in this budget then?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Let's talk about the Midwest floods. Obviously, from the pictures that I've seen, I know spring flooding, I guess, is always an event, but just the pictures of Nebraska alone and Iowa are pretty staggering. What concerns you most about this situation, and can you characterize that disaster, and do you believe there is adequate funding in this disaster relief fund to be able to manage this? And lastly, in this question, as I've heard my fellow senators talk about the disaster, a lot of it is agriculture based. It's livestock and crops. And I don't think FEMA covers that. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yes, ma'am. We've been in constant contact, I think, even before the flooding in Nebraska actually happened with the state. I personally talked to Governor Ricketts a few times, both pre and post flooding. We have our Region 8 administrator that's spent significant time up there post-disaster to make sure that the state has everything they need. I think for Nebraska, they have not seen this level of flooding in 50 years. I think that's kind of their view of how devastating this flooding is right now. Right now, the level of flooding is subsided and is generally stable. We're going into flooding season, so I'm sure we'll see peaks and valleys when it comes to flooding. Mm-hmm. Right now, Nebraska has no unmet needs. We have all our federal partners up there to include Corps of Engineers and USDA to make sure that we meet the requirements of the state and the governor's recovery plan. So when it comes to agriculture, USDA is responsible for that. Levees and river management is the Corps of Engineers. And we're up there as a team together, mm-hmm. and we'll stay connected as long as the state needs us up there and until the recovery is complete.
Thank you. When you were in my office, I think we engaged in a conversation about, I mentioned the 2016 floods in West Virginia. We are having some issues with reciting several of the schools, in particular Hoover and Clendenin Elementary, and then 2 schools in Nicholas County. I've talked with Mary Ann Tierney more than a few times about this. I think it's reasonable to expect the community to get very impatient with the bureaucracies of acquiring property, all the environmental assessments. What can you say to a community that's now 3 years past the flood who are in temporaries? what kind of partnership can we expect for FEMA to move this much quicker? They did you just released $1 million last week for property acquisition. That was good news, but we need to move a little faster here.
Yes, ma'am. I think generally recovery is never fast enough, especially for those that are impacted by disaster. We recognize that. When it comes to this particular issue, I actually talked to Mary Ann yesterday. I think we're on a glide path to a solution on some of these issues around environmental issues. I think we're in good shape, and she believes that we're going to resolve this quickly without any more bureaucratic roadblocks. I think part of our why it goes slow, we want to make sure that we do it right up front. One of the things we want to avoid, and having been a state director and having been a beneficiary of a federal disaster, the last thing you want to do is have the federal government come back and ask you for money that you misspent, a clawback, as we call it.
Right.
And we want to make sure that we avoid that, and sometimes that due diligence takes longer than people like, but it's in the best interest of FEMA, it's the best interest of, in this case, the state, and I think it's in the best interest of the taxpayers. I think we'll get to a resolution that we all can be proud of here shortly.
Well, we've had more than a few bumps in the road on this recovery effort. Some, I think, at the state level have fallen short. But it's the stages of grief of a disaster, which you're well familiar with, when the community doesn't want their schools moved, they can't, and then all of a sudden they realize the school's gone. We want to keep the school in our community, sited in our community, and in a shrinking environment, it's a daunting challenge. So I hope that we can. I know she's coming on Friday. I hope we can get some resolution, some good news for the community and for the school boards there. So I appreciate your work on that,